It's my privilege to end this conference today, having this keynote. Fred Paas. If you don't know Fred Paas, you can leave the door, please. Fred Paas is Professor of Educational Psychology at the Department of Psychology, Education and Child Studies of Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and Professorial Fellow at the School of Education Early Start of the University of Wollongong in Australia. In his research, he has been using cognitive load theory to investigate the design of effective and efficient learning environments by applying contemporary multidisciplinary scientific knowledge about the human cognitive and physical system. He is the editor-in-chief of the journal Educational Psychology Review and fellow of the American Educational Research Association. And a little personal note here, he was my supervisor in my PhD in Australia, so I feel this is kind of closing the circle, having the honor to have him in Chile. So please welcome Fred Paas.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, and also thank you for the great organization, also the other people who have organized the conference. I had some great 2 days already and 2 great evenings. Today I'm going to give the third keynote and the last keynote, but actually I think it's the first one and the only keynote if you could consider it from a literal point of view, because I'm going to actually note the key areas, the key future areas of cognitive load theory. And I'm going to do that with your help, or I did that with your help, because I asked you all to send me your ideas about this. And so in the first half of my presentation, I will focus on some work that I have been doing with my students and with my international collaborators, and some areas that I think are important. And in the second part of the presentation, I will go into the key areas that you have identified, and maybe we can have some discussion about them. That's good that I show them, because it's a very broad range of ideas. I'm first going to talk about the working memory depletion effect. Well, as you have heard in the past 2 days, this is a very important effect. At least it is studied a lot, and I think it is the effect which I heard most often in the past 2 days. Then I'm going to talk about the self-management effect of cognitive load. I haven't heard about that in the past 2 days, but I think it's a really new and interesting effect. Then finally, I'm going to talk about the moderators of perceived cognitive load, which I think is really important. Many people think that we need more objective measures and are trying to find more objective measures always, but I think that these subjective measures are actually really very important, and it is also important to know how they are affected, by which factors they are affected. So with regard to working memory depletion, since the inception of cognitive load theory in the early 1980s by John Sweller, we have actually implicitly assumed that working memory is an limited resource. And that means that the working memory, as we always say, can hold or work with no more than 4 to 6 or 7 information elements, and but we had never thought, at least until some time ago, about how long you can do this, because it seems rather strange to think that there is an endless that we can keep on investing the same amount of working memory resources. And I was already aware of that when I read in the 2000 paper by Baumeister and Maraven, which was on self-regulation and depletion of limited resources. And they focused on well, they said, does self-control resemble a muscle? And well, a muscle is also a biological system, but we have a lot of biological systems, and all these systems are characterized by the fact that they can be depleted and that you need some rest to recover. And so for working memory, that should also be the case, I think. And the self-control studies were based on studies in which they had children, for instance, and they offered them candies, but they were not allowed to eat candies. And also for people who are on a diet and who see chocolate and they have to control themselves not to eat it, and actually not doing it is requiring more effort than doing it or eating the chocolate. And they show that if they have resisted this several times, which requires resources, then the resources are depleted, and then they will be tempted to, or they will actually take some of the candies or the chocolate. So the idea was then that working memory also works like this. If we invest resources for a certain amount of time, or maybe a large amount of resources, then after some time we will not be able to invest the same amount of resources, and that is actually the working memory depletion effect. So working memory depletion occurs when cognitive effort on one task depresses performance on a later task due to the first task depleting the resources available to complete the second task. And depleted resources can be restored after rest periods. So that's the essence of the working memory depletion effect. And there was already a lot of evidence for this effect, not in cognitive load theory, but in other fields. And one of the effects is, well, I have to say that all these effects were found in more fundamental studies, and also with not always working memory tasks, but they also use working memory tasks, but it's not, they never used learning tasks as we do in cognitive load theory. So Brandon Schmeichel published an article, and he showed that attentional control, memory updating, and emotion regulation can reduce the capacity of working memory. I'm not going into detail of the studies, that would take too much time, but so he actually showed that this depletion effect is a general effect. So it depletes, it's a general depletion of working memory resources. So this is one line. Then there was a study by Healy, Hasher, and Danilova, and they actually showed that the working memory depletion effect is a specific effect. So you have to, the task that you use to deplete the resources, that task is only affected if you use it at the test. So if you use another part of working memory, then there are no effects. That's what they actually showed, and that might also be important when we look at the results that we have seen in the past few days, like on André Tricot. He mentioned that he could not replicate the effect, and Uhao and Bobo have found the effect. So one of the possible reasons for not finding the effect is the kind of specificity you use for the test to deplete the resources, and the test with which you test the depletion of the resources. One other line of research that provides some evidence for the depletion is the so-called attention restoration theory, which is also already an older theory, but they show that the attentional resources can be depleted, and they use attentional tasks. And one typical example of a study that they do is that they provide students with a selective attention task, so that's a pre-test. Then they have them either walk in an urban environment or a natural environment. And the idea is that in the natural environment, the attentional resources can be restored faster than in an urban environment, because an urban environment involves a lot of stimuli that take also use attentional resources, and that's not the case in the natural environment. So then after that, the participants have to do this selective attention task again, and then they can see whether whether the resources were restored more in the natural environment than in the urban environment. And that's what they systematically found. And they also found this not only for really being in the environment, but also if you look at pictures of nature or urban environments. So the same results after looking at natural pictures, the selective attention resources are restored faster than when you look at urban pictures. Well, we recently replicated this effect, but also for on a working memory task, and we found the same effect. But I'm not going to go deep into that because this is still under review, this study. So one last line of evidence, which is rather suggestive evidence, but I have always considered it as evidence for the working memory depletion effect, are the studies that we have done in which the students were confronted with different arrangements of complex and simple tasks, and in which the students either had to rate the mental effort after each task or only at the end, one time at the end of each task. And then we compared the average of the different ratings after each task to the rating that was done one time after all tasks. And when you look at that, then you will find that the single rating is always higher than the average of the different ratings that people gave. So that could be also evidence for mental effort depletion or working memory depletion. So the conclusion based on this preliminary evidence was that none of the tasks that has been studied were learning tasks, but it seems reasonable to hypothesize that learning conditions requiring an increase in cognitive effort or an extension of cognitive effort over time would have a similar effect on working memory resource depletion. And that was, I think, in 2016 when Hao conducted the studies on working memory depletion with Chris, John, and myself. In these studies, there were actually 2 experiments, and in these studies we tried to extend cognitive load theory by including the working memory resource depletion, and also apply this extension to explain the spacing effect. And well, the spacing effect, you probably all know about this. It was already studied in the late 19th century by Ebbinghaus. And that means that you learn more if your study moments are spaced than when you do massed practice. Also, if you cram everything, that leads to worse learning than if you space your study. And so the hypothesis here was that higher working memory resource depletion should be found after massed practice than after spaced practice. And I think we also found this. So there was higher working memory resource depletion after mass practice and after space practice, and it was also shown in the perceived difficulty ratings, which were higher in the mass practice condition than in the space practice condition. So the main conclusion here of these studies and the previous evidence is that the assumption that for each individual the working memory capacity is essentially fixed needs to be modified. Working memory is depleted by cognitive effort and recovers with rest. maybe it's good to mention that the article of Oahu and the co-authors, that this article is really very often cited, which is interesting. And well, what is more interesting is if you look at who cites the article. So it's only a part of the citations is from people in cognitive flow theory who find it interesting, but a lot of other citations are from people who really hate the application of cognitive flow theory to the spacing effect and who try to say that it's not a good way to explain the spacing effect, because they did already find many different other explanations, like Bobo has yesterday showed some of these explanations. But of course, that's also a good way to get citations for your research if you do some controversial work. So this also leads to some important questions. And one of them is, well, does the effect really exist? Well, I think it exists, but of course we don't know exactly. See, Andres, he couldn't find it, and so there are other studies in which it is not found. So this is a question that needs to be answered first. And if it exists, then you could ask how much effort and for how long must be exercised before there is significant depletion. And what is the speed at which the resources can be restored? These are all interesting questions for future research. And also one very important question is, what are the consequences of the working memory depletion effect on the other cognitive float effects? So, of course, we have always explained, for instance, the work example effect in a certain way, but we did not consider this working memory depletion. So it might be that also the older explanations need some fine-tuning, or maybe need to be totally different. But because it could be that, for instance, problem solving is not really that bad for novices if they get some rest after solving the problems. So that could be, but that's of course a question that needs to be answered empirically. Well, so far for working memory depletion. We're also doing quite some studies recently on the self-management of cognitive load. Well, you can call it an effect. We all know, of course, that cognitive flow theory has given us a comprehensive collection of techniques that when employed by instructional designers or teachers can lead to increased learner performance by substituting productive for unproductive load. So we have all these great techniques, and instructional designers can apply them, and teachers can apply them, and then the students will learn more than if they work with the conventional materials. But what happens when the learners are confronted with materials that are not designed with cognitive flow theory in mind? And that's what most often happens, actually. So most students look at online materials or in books and materials that are not cognitive load compliant. So you could say then maybe that the students who have worked with the cognitive load materials are actually less well equipped to deal with these problems that are not designed according to cognitive load theory. And so that's a potential problem. And what a potential solution to this problem is then the so-called self-management effect, in which we argue that we can teach the students to apply the cognitive load techniques to reduce or maybe to manage their own cognitive load. So if they are confronted with non-CLT compliant materials, they know then how to deal with the materials. So that this has been done in several studies so far. The first one was already in 2012. And the techniques that are used in these studies is that the students are made aware of the fact that mostly these studies are done on split attention examples. So how students can deal with split attention examples, and they are made aware of how they can deal with these examples. So of course, you can learn more from split attention examples if you integrate the information, so integrate the visual and textual information, for example. And so they learn that they can, for instance, circle the relevant information, number elements, highlight keywords. We have used materials in which they could actually move the different materials to each other. Highlighting and drawing arrows has been used, and physically or mentally moving. Well, moving I didn't already mention, but we also did a study in which we asked the students to imagine that they move the elements to the right place, and that actually also had a positive effect. Last studies that we are doing are with finger pointing, and I'm going to show an example of that. But first, I would like to focus on the typical design of these studies, which is rather interesting, I think. Normally we compare 3 groups, and there are 2 phases in the experiment. There is a conventional split attention instruction group, of course, and there is an integrated instruction group, which is the typical design to find the split attention effect, in which you would find better learning results for the integrated format than for the split attention format. And there is an additional group, of course, which is the self-management group, in which the learners are guided or told how they can deal with the split attention effect. So after they have done this, they receive a test, and well, you would expect that you would of course expect to find the split attention effect. Integrated is better than conventional split attention. And split attention, the self-management effect would also become visible in the results on this test. Well, we would normally expect, we hope that it is just as good as integrated examples, but it should be better than the conventional split attention examples. But the interesting part of the design is the second phase, which is added to the studies. So after that, the students receive new materials in a new domain normally, in which and all students are now confronted with split attention materials. So you could say that these people who have worked with the non-compliant materials are used to do that, and they deal again with the split attention materials. This is the problematic group who has worked with the good, well-designed examples and now is confronted with split attention examples. And this is the group who has learned to deal with split attention examples. And so on the test that is done here, we expect and also mostly find that this self-management group performs better and even better than the integrated instruction group. So these are some typical materials that were used in a study in which we used pointing. So there was a split attention example, which is actually some materials borrowed from some German researchers. Here is the integrated example, and this is about learning about the nephron, so a part of the kidney, cell of the kidney, how it works. In this condition, the students were asked or told that they could deal with the split attention examples to point at the associated information in the text and the graph. And so this was the first phase, and then of course the test, and then they received the second phase, which was a totally different material on the warm water boiler, I think. So this is one of these studies, and what is interesting to mention in this studies, and which is actually something different, but that in some of these studies, we were not able to find the split attention effect, which is really strange because that has been found many times before. And so we were wondering why that was not the case. And one idea was that the materials that we used, we presented the students with these materials on A4 size paper. So that is rather small. That's, well, it would look like this. And the idea was that, well, you won't find the split attention effect because the integrated example becomes rather dense. The information becomes really dense in these examples on the small format. So actually, learning from a split attention example might in this case be superior to learning from the integrated format. And so when we conducted some other studies in which we compared this information on A4 format to the same information on A3 format, which is twice as large, we found the split attention effect in these materials on this size, but not in this size. So that's an interesting thing. Well, you could call it how is it called? A productive failure. So we find something which is actually a failure, but what is really interesting because it could be a new boundary condition for the split attention effect. And well, I would call it the visual complexity effect. So the split attention effect can be caused by a cognitive complexity effect, by high intrinsic load, but it can also be affected by visual complexity. Like in the small format, the visual complexity in terms of the amount of information per unit, per square inch, for instance, is higher than in the larger size format. Okay, the moderators of perceived cognitive load. As I said, I found this really important, and I work already on this since I think 1990, when I was doing research on exercise physiology and in sports. And in these fields, they typically use the Borg scale, which is a scale in which they ask the participants to rate their perceived exertion. So they exercise and at different levels, and they are asked to rate their perceived exertion on a scale which goes from 60 to 180, and which perfectly correlates with the heart rate, if you measure the heart rate also. But so that's why I thought we can also use this scale for cognitive work, and that's how the scale came into this field. And this scale in exercise physiology is already used, I think, for 50 or 60 years, and so that's really a very strong measurement technique they use. And I'm convinced that the subjective measurement in cognitive load theory is just as important. But one effect, for instance, that we are currently, or which we have studied, is what I call the so-called relative complexity effect. So you can imagine that, well, everyone knows that if you drive with a car and you drive with a speed of 90 kilometers per hour, and you go to a speed of 60 kilometers per hour, then 60 feels rather slow. Whereas if you drive 30 for some time and you go to 60, then it feels rather fast. So it's the same speed, 60, but it can feel totally different. And the same is also with exercise or sports. Well, if you run at a high speed for some time and you go to a lower speed, then the speed might feel very comfortable. But if you run at a slow speed and go to the same speed, then it might feel very hard. So this is what the idea here that the rating on the same task can be influenced by what people did before. So if they first work on low complexity tasks and then have to work on a medium complexity task, or three medium complexity tasks, or high complexity and then medium complexity, then you would expect different measurements or different ratings of perceived load on these tasks. And that's what we actually found and is currently submitted at the journal. Okay, now for the second part, which is the part that you also contributed to. And what do you think are the key areas for future cognitive load research? And well, I want to ask you, who would you first like to call if you want to know what the future areas are? Who would you like to, from who would you like to know this first? Any idea?
John.
John. Yeah, okay, well, that's what I thought. That's why I made him. He's working on the, as you know, on spacing and interleaving effects and tries to make them cognitive load theory effects. So that is one line of research, and then he has some studies about using biologically primary scales to teach biologically secondary scales, and the biologically primary skill in this case is storytelling. And I think that's an interesting, an interesting technique. I haven't seen any results from these studies, but we'll probably see them soon.
Not that soon. We just put him in the application.
Oh, are you? Okay. Okay. Well, then next one, Paul Jins again, with an interesting remark, I think. I think that was you, Paul? Yeah. So the argument here was that it would be good if we would work together and maybe in teams and try to replicate the results of the studies that we are doing, because of course we do this, we work on the same effects, but we use different materials or different types of students, so the different designs, so these things are different. So if we don't find the result in one condition and we find it in the other condition, we never know what exactly there was the reason for that. So replication studies are really popular now, and the field needs these studies. So I think it's a very good suggestion which we should try to follow up on. And I'm willing to have an issue in Education Psychology Review based on these replication studies.
Does anyone know of funding where we can do that?
No.
It's international. No. I acknowledge the complexity of doing this. We have to be really, really well organised.
Yeah.
The same thing, having ethics and so forth.
Yeah, well, then that's your task then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this is one interesting point. Then there were, of course, many people who think that working memory depletion is an effect that is important. Well, you can guess who the first, who presented the first reason, the first area. So André mentioned that he failed to obtain the working memory depletion effect in 10 experiments. So that is actually also a reason for the replication studies, but because he used the different materials, different students, and so it would be important to see why he failed to find it and why we found it. And well, maybe one of the reasons is the specificity of the relation between the learning materials and the test materials, but of course we don't know. Yeah, okay, so here are some areas mentioned for working memory depletion, and they were, I think I mentioned them already before. So several people also think that the measurement of cognitive load is important, as usual. I think many people try to
work on this, and as I said, often try to find the techniques, physiological techniques, fancy techniques to measure it. Are there any remarks here?
Maybe one short remark, because I find it quite interesting that there are, well, comparably many of these points. I was surprised I'm one of those. It would be interesting at one point of time to like collect all the information, who is assessing like at what point of time and with which items. I mean, we've heard a lot at the conference already, but like to have an overview, so that we see in which direction we should go, what probably hasn't been done already yet. So,
yeah, of course. There's you see the 2003 article in which we provide a kind of review, and I'm afraid that if we would do that now, that there were not many changes, but it would be, of course, very important to do. I think it's, okay, I go on to the next one because of time. So this is actually Paul Ayres, and he notes, and this is actually based on an article that we are currently writing. This is more about the theoretical aspects of the different types of cognitive load, and especially germane load, which has, as he said, has mutated over the years. So. And we seem to use the different definitions, not only over time, but also at the same time we use different definitions. And so I think that is an important part for cognitive flow theory to have this right, because we will be critiqued by people in other fields, or also, for this fact. If you have a theory that is good, then you have to have clear definitions. And are there any remarks to this comment? Yes?
Not to add more confusion to this, but we talked about this quite a bit at the Kingston conference last year. And when I think about, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, Fred, when we think about cognitive load theory as a theory of education, teaching, I can get behind the concept of germane load as part of intrinsic load. When we extend cognitive load theory to performance, I don't know how germane load is relevant or whether it could be measured. And I don't know if anyone has thoughts on that. Essentially, the crux of the question is whether there is more or less of a relevance of germane load in certain settings, like performance settings, where we're using cognitive load to understand performance.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, but I'm not sure whether we should go into that now, because I don't think the time allows that. But I think that's certainly an interesting point to consider, and which we should actually add to the slides. Yeah. Okay, so here are some other points that were mentioned. Okay, so self-regulated learning. Well, we did already have a discussion on that. I think it's an important field, and many people are working on that and trying to integrate it also with cognitive load theory. And then there are some people interested in disabled students, special needs education, and early childhood. So I think that's a specific group of interests. Are there any comments on that? Or if that's someone who provided these points?
Well,
yeah.
Well, I just try to convince you of the relevance of the point with my talk.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. Let me see. So the first one is actually maybe part of the self-management effect. It's of course good if you know how people are actually managing their load. Okay. biologically primary as a basis for teaching biologically secondary skills. And then there are some points which were submitted by Slava Kaliuga, who is mainly interested in adaptive education. So adapting the learning tasks to the learner by, for instance, using a rapid assessment technique for that. Any comments on this?
I've always wondered why the rapid diagnostic tool that Slava developed didn't get used a lot more. I thought it was a great line of research, and we just don't see it having made too much impact.
Yeah.
I was really impressed by it. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. I agree, and it's only yeah. Of course, it's. I think we all agree that it is very important to adapt the instruction to the learner, and so I'm not sure about the reason for why it's not picked up. This is something that is not it's sometimes a mystery for why some effects are keep on studied. We keep studying these some effects, and others are they seem to die out. Okay.
Fred, I think that this question is really relevant to teachers, so they can take some strategies to check for understanding in the class and do some adaptations. And I work in knowledge dissemination about cognitive load and others cognitive science applied to education, and I think this is one of the most important issues for teachers. They are really interested in how to adapt their teaching in the class, in the moment, and I think that is really difficult to us of all that teach some subject.
Yeah, no, I also think that's really important. But I think that for instance, the technique that Slava has introduced is not really useful in the classroom, because it's very difficult for a teacher to do this with every student. So that would take too much time. But if you have an online learning system, then it works perfect, I think, because then you can do it. It doesn't take time; it actually saves time. But also for teachers, it would be good to maybe to know how much effort a student has invested for certain materials, and to respond to that, because there might be huge differences in the classroom.
I was thinking about some strategies like Hing questions, like you do a question to students, and you have two possible responses to do it with to students, and like two ways to direct the rest of the class. This is some ideas that I have read from Harry Fletcher Good from UK, that he's a teacher and he's trying to apply this knowledge to his classes, and he developed this idea of thinking before your class, like when you are planning these possibilities to do a question, and depending on the responses, you can choose one way to explain the content or another way, or go back to the basic concept, etc.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks. Okay, this is the last slide, so if Paul has a remark? Yeah.
Thanks. On that point of practical application of cognitive load theory, creation of easy-to-follow recommendations for teachers and instructors, the New South Wales Department of Education have developed a really good set of teacher-oriented practice guides around cognitive load theory. And so that would be my go-to for anyone who wants to pass this on to pre-service teachers or teachers. So if anyone needs help in finding that, please just contact me and I'll send you the website. But yeah, I think it was developed by colleagues at Armidale, University of New England, Bing New, and so I just wanted to give her credit for that. But yeah, it's really good. But there's also a number of sort of books oriented towards cognitive load theory now. In the UK, there's a guy called Mr. Barton, Mr. Barton's Maths. Yeah, well, there we go. Yeah, so I think there are some really good resources out there already that are communicating our ideas quite well to practitioners. So that's good.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Thanks. Yeah, of course, we keep on introducing new effects, so books need to be adapted after some time. Yeah. Okay, are there any other remarks? Comments? Or? Because then I would like to end the presentation. No? Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thanks, Fred. Thank you, Fred. Thanks for the great keynote. So this is a little something for you.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Now, well, is there any one more question or something? Comment or no? Okay. One over there.
It is about physiological signature of cognitive load.
Mm-hmm.
I was asking myself if you could, or if we could, get into a neural signature of cognitive load, an online measure of it. For example, if we could link cognitive load to the use of energy by the brain, and if it has already been done, could you comment on this?
Yeah, there are some studies that have used fMRI, but well, you can imagine that they use rather fundamental tasks. It's difficult to have students learn actually
tasks that we normally learn in the classroom or as a student. So these tasks are more fundamental, like working memory tasks, are also learning tasks, but very fundamental tasks, and it seems to work well. But of course, fMRI is really expensive. It's really difficult to get access, and so that's one technique. And then we have EEG is also one technique that is used. I think the same issue there, that although there are some mobile EEG measurements, but well, if you look into the literature, people use it and say it works well, but it's not used again, because I think it's still very difficult and can be intrusive to the learning process.
So eye tracking would be the best option?
Yeah, it depends on what you want to know. I think if you have specific hypotheses about, for instance, elements of the instructional materials that impose a higher load than the other, then it is a very useful technique. And of course, we have also shown that pupil dilation is related to the mental effort invested. So I think it's a useful technique, and especially with the newer glasses and the smaller equipment, it's rather easy also to use it actually in the learning situation.
So you have also shown in the, with the simulation that it can be very useful.
Okay, the last question by David and
actually, to follow on with the matter of physiological measures, I do think it's a big area to look at. Of course, the logistical challenges are substantial, but one of the things that concerns me a little bit about some of our endeavors into it, using these measures appropriately and analyzing those data is very, very complex. And a lot of the marketed devices like the Tobii glasses, which are a wonderful, easily used tool, it turns out when you pop the lid and look inside the black box, some of that data analysis is really problematic. So it's a challenge, and it's a challenge in part because our community is somewhat insular, and there are whole fields that develop these tools and understand the underlying dynamics. And I think it's really important that we engage those. We had a line of research that was cut short by the pandemic. I mean, everybody did, at least one. But using some of these physiological tools with real experts in the field. And one of the things we found was that FNIR's bold response data, which is a cheaper and lighter way of doing MRI type measure, correlated perfectly with saccadic fixation when we imposed extraneous load through split attention with real materials and so on. But the self-reported cognitive load measures didn't correlate with those. So there are major data considerations, but there are also major convergent validity issues that need some careful examination. And hopefully we can resurrect that particular line soon. We have a few things we didn't have a chance to follow up on that might be helpful. But there are a lot of challenges, and I think one of the solutions is being less insular as a community for where we find the expertise to engage those particular types of measures.
very short.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that, the other thing with physiologic measures, it all depends on whether you're in a nice controlled experimental setting or in the real world. We've looked at Effner's EEG, heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, pupillometry in a simulation world. And one of the reasons I'm not presenting that data this year at the conference is because it's a disaster. But we've looked at it. The most promising of those is probably pupil data, saccadic movements, to some degree pupillometry. And pupillometry in the real world is difficult because the human light reflex is much more powerful, on the order of like an order of magnitude more powerful than any pupil changes related to cognitive load. But there are some new algorithms that have been created that can subtract out light luminance and light reflex so that we can use it a little bit more in the real world, but those are still early days. But suffice it to say, out of all of those metrics, probably pupils and saccadic fixations are the most reliable in real world, in the wild settings.
So thanks again, Fred. That was a beautiful way to finish the conference, so we have more food for thought when we continue collaborating via email or in the rest of today.